A simple woman was fishing by the edge of a quiet lake, a lake she had visited since childhood, a place that felt like the only piece of peace she still had. The line danced lightly on the surface of the water, and for a brief moment, she forgot the weight of bills, the cold stares at the grocery store, and the feeling of being invisible in a place where wealth whispered louder than character. But that moment shattered when a voice rang out behind her, sharp, condescending, and drenched in superiority. "You can't fish here," the woman said, stepping closer, her arms crossed, a phone already in her hand. "This isn't a public swamp, this is private land, and you don't belong here. People like you don't respect boundaries." The simple woman barely looked up, not out of submission, but because her body was frozen in disbelief. "This lake doesn't have a fence," she muttered. "It's been open for years." But the neighbor smirked, took a photo, and called someone anyway, not because of rules or safety, but because power, for some, is addictive. And that day, the woman wasn't just humiliated, she was made to feel like nothing, like her presence dirted the air. What no one knew was that humiliation ignited something. What felt like the final drop was, in fact, the beginning of a storm. That night, the woman didn't cry. She didn't shout. She made a phone call. The next morning, the lake was off limits. The private land the neighbor was so eager to protect. It had a new owner. The woman they shamed now had keys, documents, and the power to lock everyone out. But it wasn't just the lake she bought, there was more, so much more. She had a plan, and a secret no one had seen coming. Why would someone like her suddenly be able to buy the most expensive property in town overnight? How could a woman everyone overlooked, everyone dismissed, turn the entire neighborhood upside down in less than 24 hours? What was she hiding all this time? And most of all, what is she going to do now that she holds all the power? Stay until the end. You won't believe what really happened. Before we dive in, we wish you a powerful and moving experience with this story. If you enjoy deep, emotional narratives with surprising twists, don't forget to subscribe to Hope Threads for more stories like this one. Brooke Miller had never imagined her life would circle back to the town of Eureka Springs, Arkansas, but here she was, 48 years old, alone, and trying her best to stitch together the remnants of a life that had quietly unraveled over the last decade. Eureka Springs wasn't the kind of place people left easily, and it certainly wasn't the kind of place you came back to without whispers trailing behind you. The hills rolled gently like they were cradling the town in secrets, and the streets, though charming, held tight to the stories of who had once thrived and who had fallen. Brooke wasn't sure yet which one she was in their eyes. She didn't own a house in the historical district, didn't host wine tastings on weekends, and definitely didn't show up to the neighborhood association meetings with homemade lemon tarts. Her house was a modest one-bedroom cabin just off an unpaved road on the outskirts of town, surrounded by tall oaks and silence. The kind of silence that could heal, or remind you of everything you'd lost. For Brooke, the cabin was more than shelter, it was all she had. After her divorce 5 years earlier, followed by the slow collapse of the bakery she once poured her soul into, she was left with just enough to buy that old cabin and a used truck that coughed every time she turned the ignition. She didn't mind. It was hers. And for someone who'd spent the last decade having things taken, her marriage, her business, her sense of worth, ownership meant something sacred. She didn't have a fancy job anymore. Instead, she pieced together small gigs, helping elderly neighbors run errands, baking pies for the local diner, sewing curtains for the little bed and breakfast across the street. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid just enough to buy groceries and gas, and to let her sneak away to the lake once in a while. Lake Waverly wasn't a tourist spot. It wasn't marked on any maps with stars or labeled as a destination. But for those who'd lived in Eureka Springs long enough, it was simply the lake. Generations had fished there, skinny dipped in the summers, thrown rocks across its surface during lazy afternoons. Brooke had spent countless hours there as a child, her father teaching her how to cast a line with patience, her mother sitting on a faded blanket under a wide-brimmed hat. Those memories were some of the only ones that hadn't turned sour. So she kept returning, casting her line into the water as if hoping to reel back time. Most mornings were peaceful. She would arrive just after sunrise, the mist still curling above the water like a soft veil. She brought her own chair, her own bait, and always left the place cleaner than she found it. Brooke never felt like she was intruding, she felt like she was returning home. But the town had changed. Over the past 10 years, new people had arrived. Wealthy people. People who called themselves preservers of local charm but, in truth, wanted to repurpose the entire town into a curated postcard. They bought up land, built towering lake houses with security cameras on the porches, and started whispering about community standards. Brooke first noticed the shift one day when she went to buy fishing gear and the clerk asked her, carefully, if she had permission to fish at Lake Waverly. She laughed, thinking it was a joke, but his eyes told her otherwise. Then came the fences. Not full fences, just little wooden signs hammered into the earth along the lake's edge that read private property, no trespassing, residents only. But those signs had no legal meaning, at least not back then. The lake, by all records, was still public. Still open. Still part of her. Or so she thought. It was on a Thursday morning, just after a rainstorm, that everything changed. Brooke had been fishing for nearly an hour, a small thermos of coffee beside her, when she heard footsteps crunching down the gravel path behind her. She didn't turn around immediately, most of the locals knew her and didn't mind her being there. But the footsteps didn't slow. They stopped right behind her. The voice that followed was unfamiliar, sharp, and cold. "You can't fish here." Brooke turned her head slowly, eyes meeting a woman in her 50s wearing spotless tennis shoes and a monogrammed windbreaker, her blonde bob perfectly sprayed into place. "This is private property. This lake is not for just anyone." Brooke blinked, unsure if she had heard right. "I'm sorry. I've been fishing here since I was a kid." The woman scoffed, taking out her phone. "Well, not anymore. People like you think rules don't apply to them. You're trespassing. I could call the sheriff right now." Brooke stood up, calmly, brushing dirt from her jeans. "This is a public lake." "Not anymore," the woman snapped. "This land belongs to the Waverly Lake Preservation Association. And unless you're a resident, which I know you're not welcome here." The words landed like stones. Not just because of what she said, but how she said it. The venom behind people like you. The certainty that she could humiliate someone without consequence. Brooke's hands trembled, not out of fear, but out of something more hollow. The kind of trembling that comes when you realize you've been reduced to less than human in someone else's eyes. She didn't argue. She gathered her things, her tackle box, her folding chair, and walked away, her boots heavy with soaked earth and shame. That night, Brooke sat at her kitchen table staring at the chipped edges of her coffee mug, the silence of the woods pressing in through the window. She wasn't angry. Not in the way people think of anger, explosive and loud. It was deeper than that. It was the quiet realization that if she didn't do something, they would erase her completely. Not just from the lake, but from the town. From her own past. And so began the first flicker of something she hadn't felt in years, resolve. She didn't know exactly how yet, or what it would cost her, but she knew this, the humiliation she'd suffered would not be the end of her story. And far beyond her cabin, in the homes that lined the lake with their floor-to-ceiling windows and curated garden paths, no one had the slightest idea that the woman they dismissed so quickly was about to become the most powerful name in the neighborhood. Because sometimes, all it takes is one act of cruelty to awaken a storm that's been waiting in silence. The sun hadn't yet risen when Brooke stepped out of her cabin with a manila envelope tucked under her arm and a steady breath in her chest. The air smelled like wet leaves and damp soil, but there was something else lingering in it, something heavier. As she walked the gravel path toward town, the trees seemed to lean in, as if they, too, were waiting to witness what was about to unfold. For weeks, she'd moved in silence, not out of fear, but out of purpose. Every step since that morning by the lake had been calculated. Every errand, every phone call, every document she signed in the dim light of her kitchen, every move had been leading to this. It started with a visit to the county clerk's office, where an old friend from high school, now a real estate assistant, pulled her aside and whispered, "If you're serious about it, now's the time. The owner passed away 2 months ago. The land's been sitting in legal limbo. No one's made an offer yet." Brooke didn't blink. She didn't ask questions. She simply asked for the paperwork. Lake Waverly, it turned out, had never been fully owned by the so-called Preservation Society. The land surrounding it had been split decades ago among private holders, most of whom had died or moved away, leaving unclear titles and open paths for acquisition. One of those paths, by sheer miracle or maybe fate, ran right through a piece of land connected to Brooke's own property. That sliver, barely a few acres, was the key. If she could acquire that, she'd control not just access to the lake, but also the private road the wealthy residents used to get to their homes. The irony didn't escape her. She liquidated what little savings she had left, took out a quiet loan under her business name, and leaned on a friend of a friend attorney who believed in justice more than money. No one noticed her meetings. No one questioned her quiet presence at the county assessor's office. Because no one ever paid attention to her. That was their first mistake. 2 weeks ago, the deal closed. Quietly, legally, completely. The land was hers. And not just the sliver. In a move that shocked even her lawyer, Brooke had outbid a local developer for the entire eastern side of Lake Waverly. The funds hadn't come from nowhere. A silent investor, a woman Brooke had once helped at the bakery during a panic attack, had called her out of the blue and offered to back her, no questions asked. "Some people deserve to win," she'd said. And just like that, the balance of power shifted without a sound. Now, standing at the edge of the lake, Brooke watched as the familiar Mercedes SUVs began to trickle in, their polished hoods catching the early light. It was Saturday, the neighborhood's self-declared Lake Day, when families came out to kayak, tan, and host their picture-perfect brunches by the water. Brooke waited until just enough of them had arrived. Then she walked to the old wooden gate and locked it. A brand new chain slid into place, followed by a sign she'd made herself. It read, "Private access. By permission only. Owner, B. Miller." The first person to notice was Linda Greaves, the same woman who had humiliated her. She walked up, tennis shoes spotless as always, face twisted in confusion. "What is this?" Linda asked, gesturing at the sign. "Where's the old gate?" Brooke looked up slowly, her voice calm. "I had it replaced." "Replaced?" Linda blinked. "Who approved that?" "This is association property." Brooke didn't flinch. "Not anymore." Linda narrowed her eyes, stepping forward, her voice climbing. "Excuse me." "I bought it," Brooke said, the words landing heavy and smooth. "The land. The access road. The lakefront. It's mine now." For a second, Linda didn't speak. Her jaw opened slightly, then closed. Her hands fluttered at her sides like they were trying to grasp something invisible. "That's impossible," she finally said, voice trembling. "You couldn't possibly afford this." Brooke raised an eyebrow. "You seem very concerned about what I can afford." "I know who you are," Linda spat. "You bake pies. You live in that shack on the edge of town." Brooke stepped closer. "And you called the sheriff on me for fishing on land you didn't even own." Linda's face flushed. "You don't belong here." Brooke tilted her head slightly, a calm, almost sorrowful expression on her face. "And yet here I am. With the deed." Behind them, more neighbors began gathering. Voices stirred, whispers passed. Brooke could hear them, the confusion, the disbelief, the panic slowly creeping in as they realized they had no legal right to enter the lake anymore. A man in golf attire stepped forward, arms crossed. You can't just lock everyone out. I can, Brooke replied, showing him the documents. But I'm not going to. A hush fell. She let that moment hang before she spoke again. What I'm going to do is offer access passes to community members who meet 3 criteria. 1, they respect the lake. 2, they don't harass others. And 3, they've never used their wealth to bully someone smaller than them. The crowd rippled with discomfort. Someone muttered, ridiculous, but no one stepped forward. Then Linda spoke again, her voice quieter this time. This is revenge. Brooke looked at her. Really looked at her. No. This is restoration. You humiliated me. You made me feel like nothing. Like trash. In front of people. For nothing more than sitting by the water and remembering my father. This, she gestured to the gate, to the lake behind her, this is me making sure no one else has to feel that again. For the first time, Linda looked small. Her mouth opened as if to say something, but no words came out. Brooke didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply turned and walked away, leaving the gate locked behind her. But even then, this wasn't the end. Something was still building, beneath the surface, behind closed doors, in whispers that had begun circling around town. Because the land Brooke had bought had more value than just water and shoreline. The development rights tied to that property could halt a multi-million-dollar project that several powerful residents had quietly invested in. They had tried to bury her. Now, they would have to negotiate with her. And Brooke? She wasn't done. Not yet. The final chapter was still to come. And it would be the most unexpected one of all. The weeks that followed were filled with tension, confusion, and a slow unraveling of everything the residents around Lake Waverly thought they understood about control, power, and entitlement. While many of them tried to dismiss Brooke's actions as petty revenge, those closest to the tangled web of real estate, permits, and financial investments knew better. Behind the glossy smiles and carefully curated front yards, panic had begun to take root. Brooke now held leverage not just over the lake, but over the future of a highly anticipated development project that had been months in the making. A group of 5 affluent residents, among them Linda Greaves and her husband, Richard, had quietly purchased land near the lake and lobbied for zoning changes to transform it into a high-end private resort. They had kept it secret, operating behind the name of a shell corporation. But now, one signature from Brooke could legally block the access road needed for that development to proceed. And she wasn't in a hurry to sign anything. Brooke didn't make a public announcement. She didn't hold a press conference or plaster her face across the local paper. She simply showed up, every day, to her land. She walked the trails she now owned, repainted the dock that had once been weathered and forgotten, and opened a small community space where anyone, regardless of where they lived, could come, sit, fish, and breathe. The only condition was kindness. No loud parties, no private events, no exclusion. Just people, sharing something real. And it was there, in that space of simplicity and welcome, that a new energy began to grow. Locals who had once felt pushed out found themselves returning. Children who had never been allowed near the lake now played barefoot on its banks. For the first time in years, the water felt open again. Linda, meanwhile, had lost something far more significant than access. Her reputation, carefully built over years of charity galas and school board meetings, began to crack. The story spread fast, not just about the lake, but about the confrontation, the humiliation, the arrogance. Some whispered that she had always been that way, always looking down her nose. Others began questioning her involvement in the now delayed development project. With every rumor, her influence diminished. She tried to regain control by organizing a petition, but it failed. Too many people had seen her for who she really was. Her fall wasn't dramatic, but slow and public. Her once-packed holiday parties went quiet. The women she once ruled over with subtle manipulation started to distance themselves. She became a shadow of the social leader she had once been, and in time, even her voice in local matters disappeared. Richard, her husband, faced consequences of a different kind. The investment into the resort was significant. When Brooke blocked access through her land, the entire project collapsed. Financial backers pulled out. A lawsuit followed. Richard lost his position at the bank where he worked, not because of the failed project, but because the scandal around it revealed ethical breaches. No one cried for him. He had spent years climbing ladders by stepping over others. Now, there was nowhere left to climb. Brooke, on the other hand, flourished, not with riches or revenge, but with a quiet, deeply earned respect. She turned the land into a cooperative project. With help from locals, she created a program teaching kids how to fish, how to respect nature, how to sit still and listen to the world around them. She invited local artists to paint murals on the dock walls and hosted free bake sales using recipes from her old bakery. People who had once passed her on the street without so much as a glance now waved, stopped, and asked how they could help. She became something far more powerful than a landowner. She became a symbol. Not everything was easy. There were still those who grumbled, who refused to admit they had been wrong. But Brooke didn't need their validation. What she had now was peace, true peace. A sense of purpose. And most of all, she had reclaimed not just the lake, but herself. The version of her that had been silenced, dismissed, overlooked, she was gone. In her place stood a woman who had learned the power of quiet strength, of persistence, and of believing in her own worth even when no one else did. One afternoon, sitting on the dock, she was approached by a young girl named Lily. She had seen her before, a quiet, curious girl who came often with her grandmother. Lily sat beside her, legs swinging above the water, and after a long pause, asked, "How did you get all this?" Brooke smiled gently. "I remembered who I was. And I stopped letting people decide what I was worth." The words hung in the air like a blessing. Some time later, an email arrived from a documentary producer who had heard about the story through a local news feature. They wanted to interview Brooke, possibly turn her journey into a short film. At first, she declined. Fame was never what she wanted. But after some reflection, she agreed, on one condition. That the documentary wouldn't just be about her, but about the town, the lake, and the lesson they all had to learn. The film premiered at a small community theater, and the crowd was filled with familiar faces, people who had walked beside her through the quiet, who had cheered not just for her triumph, but for the truth it represented. When the credits rolled, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Brooke stood silently at the back, not seeking the spotlight. She had already won, in every way that mattered. And maybe that's the point. Because sometimes, victory doesn't come with applause or headlines. It comes in the form of a lake restored, of children laughing where there was once silence, of dignity reclaimed in the face of arrogance. Now, to you listening, what would you do if someone tried to erase your worth with a single sentence? Would you walk away quietly, or would you rise, like Brooke did, and build something stronger from the very place where they tried to break you? Every day, we are given a choice, to accept the roles others give us, or to rewrite the story ourselves. What did you feel listening to Brooke's journey? Did it remind you of something you've been through, or someone you know? We want to hear your voice. Share your thoughts in the comments, your experiences, your victories, your turnarounds. Let's keep this conversation alive. And if stories like this move you, if they remind you that strength can come from the quietest places, then don't forget to subscribe to Hope Threads. There's more to come. And believe me, you won't want to miss what's next.